Billions of stars illuminated the sky that loomed above the White Mountain National Forest. Corinne Johnson could see them easily from her seat on the bench on the path which led to Saturday Falls. Perhaps those stars really could tell her something. Stars were a map to the future, or at least that was something she had believed a long time ago. There are certainly a lot of stars out tonight. Corinne nudged her friend Farah, who was seated beside her. Farah Cressman, who tucked her wavy chocolate-brown hair into a bun, was wearing a denim jacket and a scarf to protect herself from North Conway's late spring chill. Corinne's co-worker and also one of her closest friends, Farah hadn't objected when she said she needed a late-night trip for some air. That there are. What's with you and stars exactly? You seem to have an unusual fascination with them. I enjoy looking at the stars. Corinne tucked a few wisps of hair behind her ears, becoming aware of how cold her fingers were. They make me feel safe, like no matter where I am in the world, they're there, shining through the darkness, watching over me. Farah tilted her head back and squinted. I've never thought about it that way, but I can understand why you would want to feel like there's something guiding you. Aside from the obvious, you moved further away from your hometown than almost anyone I know. Corinne breathed in deeply as she traced the stars that formed the Big Dipper with her eyes. Unlike Farah, she lived very far away from the place where she'd grown up. Not since living there had she really felt like herself. Though Baton Rouge was 2,000 miles away, it might as well have been a million. Her own mother barely spoke to her. Corinne supposed she had no one to blame for that but herself. I only wish the stars really could guide me. Maybe if they could give me some answers, it wouldn't feel as though I'm carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. You're getting married, Farah said. It isn't as if you're going off to war. Not when the man I'm marrying is Brent Lombardi. Brent was the man Corinne had married when she was 17, the man she'd married because she was young and pregnant, then gone on to have a second child with. Clearly she had worked overtime to convince herself she was in love with that man, because it hadn't been until years later when she realized with whom she was involved. She'd divorced him. Now, after 5 years of him pleading with her to believe he wasn't the person she'd thought, she was about to give the father of her children a second chance. You stayed in North Conway after you and Brent split, all alone, while your family was in another part of the country. I think you're a lot stronger than you're giving yourself credit for. Maybe I am, Corinne said, though she certainly didn't feel strong. The girl who'd beaten Stacy Heaton out for school student council president had vanished the moment she'd discovered she was having a baby. Remaining in North Conway after her divorce had been her only way of coping with her circumstances. She drew an uneasy breath. I thought it would be easier staying in North Conway. Since I was already working and going to school, it just didn't make sense to pack up and move back home. Her friend knew the story all too well. At least she knew the watered-down version Corinne was willing to offer. But what Farah didn't know was that Brent had fought the judge in order to gain custody of Ethan and Maddie, and saw to it that she couldn't even visit with her kids at all until 2 years later when he came back to North Conway, saying he was dropping the custody suit and insisted they share equal blocks of time with their children. After that, they dealt with one another amicably, neither of them having very much to do with the other. Over time, they had become friends, and eventually Brent turned on the charm, the way he had when she was a teenager. When Brent proposed to her for the second time, Corinne was so taken aback that she'd almost turned him down flat. But after considering the matter, she'd come to realize she was no longer the 17-year-old girl who dreamed of her prince coming along. Being married to Brent Lombardi would provide her security and essentially power, because Brent was very unlikely to try and take Ethan and Maddie away from her again if they were married. A successful businessman, Brent came from an influential family, which was why he'd been able to obtain custody of their children so easily the first time. Corinne's worst nightmare was that he would somehow try to take them away from her again. You're not afraid to make decisions, Farah said. At least, you don't make them out of fear. My parents lived that way. I think the fact that they were always so worried about money is the reason they encouraged me to be with Brent in the first place. Farah nodded. That makes sense with everything you've told me about them. Brent and I never had the sort of relationship I hoped we would, but now that I'm older and have 2 children to think about, I'm just not sure the things I thought were so important really matter anymore. Love, passion, Corinne said. What is that exactly? Nothing I've ever had. I divorced a creep to marry Mr. Nice Guy. Benjamin is great. He's there when I need him. But that head over heels, over the moon, stomach doing somersaults sort of thing, I've only had that once. I promise you, it only leads to trouble. Maybe Farah had a point. Maybe passion, like the kind of passion that made your toes curl and your eyes roll back in your head, just didn't exist. There was only one man Corinne had ever felt that sort of passion for. He was long out of her life. Why not marry a man for security, a man who would make her feel exactly that, safe? Reliability and financial security weren't such bad things to have when you were living in the real world. And it wasn't only herself she had to think about. She needed to think about her children. The best thing for them was that they have both their mother and their father in their lives. Farah stood and stretched her arms. Ready to head out? I'm getting bitten to death by mosquitoes, and I don't think they're planning on backing down anytime soon. It's all right, you go ahead, Corinne insisted. I think I'm going to stay out here a while longer. All right, but don't stay out too long. You don't want to have mosquito bites up and down your arms when you walk down the aisle. Farah offered a light smile and a wave before heading down the path to her car. Corinne watched her friend until she could no longer see her, then sat back on the bench and closed her eyes. She'd be surprised if a forest ranger didn't appear within minutes to tell her she needed to leave the trail, but she would stay as long as she could in the serenity of the woods as the moon shined down on her and the cool breeze hit her face. Keeping her eyes closed, Corinne allowed the sounds of nature to soothe her fried nerves. North Conway's forests offered some of the most peaceful tranquility she'd ever known, and she wanted to try and relax as much as she could before she went home to see her kids. She was stressed, as usual, and she never wanted Ethan and Maddie to see her that way. It was hard to be upset about anything when you were surrounded by natural beauty, lush green trees, and some of the most beautiful rivers and mountains in the world. Corinne must have dozed off for a minute, because when she opened her eyes, the woods around her were much darker than they'd been before. The stars she'd been admiring were still in their place, but they weren't as clear as they'd been earlier. The full moon, which had lit up half the sky, had disappeared behind a cloud. Corinne rubbed her arms as she stood, realizing that the temperature had dropped significantly. The wind had kicked up and it was rustling swiftly through the trees. All of them swayed in the same direction, their long pine branches blowing toward the river, the mountain above it, and the valley below. The powerful gust seemed to whisper something over the sound of the rushing water below it. Corinne. Assuring herself that the wind didn't talk, Corinne buttoned her jacket and slipped her hands inside her pockets. Moving along the dirt path, she'd only walked a few steps when she heard the sound again. Someone was chanting, and they were calling her name. Corinne. Corinne's heart thumped in her chest. Someone was watching her, only she couldn't see them. As she turned in the direction of the trees, she felt a warm sensation spread along her arms and legs. It seemed to urge her in the direction that the sound was coming from, the woods on the other side of the river. Filled with an overwhelming desire to follow the sound, Corinne turned toward the river. The body of water was shallow, full of rocks which made it difficult yet not impossible to cross to the other side. Lifting one leg, she placed the sole of her shoe against the stone beneath it. Keeping her arms out to the sides to maintain her balance, she stepped from one rock to the other, moving stealthily over the rush of the water, bending to place her hands against the final rock for support. She stepped onto the ground and found herself encased in a maze of thin trees which lined the riverbank. She was on a hill which began to level off the lower it went. Looking down toward what appeared to be the base of the mountain, Corinne was overpowered by the desire to move deeper into the forest. Traveling on without hesitation, Corinne allowed her instincts as well as the newly reappeared moon to guide her. Never before had she done anything so reckless, but this strong inner feeling told her that she was safe, that her children were safe, that she needed to stop hesitating and keep moving. Corinne wandered through the grass, dirt, and rocks, unafraid of what sort of wild animals might be lurking about or how deep into the woods she'd gone. The forest was one gigantic maze of trees, and they were difficult to navigate through when all of them looked the same. She wasn't entirely sure of how to go back the way she'd come, yet her legs walked on. Some time later, when her feet were about to give out, she noticed a streak of orange light shining through the trees. There was a clearing ahead, and in its center was a fire. A person was standing several feet away from her, facing the fire. Corinne kept her eyes on the back of the person's head, coming to realize as she moved across the small open field that he or she was wearing a black cloak, and that a hood covered his or her head. The person appeared to be as tall as the trees surrounding them and seemed to emanate as much heat as the fire itself. She crept closer until she and the figure were standing only a few feet apart. Corinne's hand lifted itself into the air, and, as if by magic, it touched down against the shoulder before her. The figure turned around, his striking green eyes locking with hers, as a smile that could only be described as wicked formed on his face. He tossed back his hood, closing off the distance between them, snatching her wrist. "Jack!" Corinne's heart pounded. She intended to throw a hand over her mouth, but one of her hands was trapped, and the other one tingled uncontrollably, remaining at her side. "Hello, Corinne," Jack said in a deep, droll voice. "It's been a long time." 7 years to be exact, but standing beside Jack Madeira, her once co-worker and friend, Corinne felt as though she'd stepped back in time and into a dream. Come to think of it, all of it felt like a dream, particularly since she didn't seem to be in control of her movements. But if she was dreaming, why did the fire's flames feel so hot? And why was her pulse racing like the ticking of a clock? Jack, whose face was sprinkled with dark facial hair that was only slightly thinner than the hair on his head, bore down on her. He smelled of incense and musk, an alluring mixture which, combined with the scent of the woods around them, was distinctly male. So lost in a mix of confusion and desire, Corinne didn't even realize that his large fingers had closed over hers. Jack squeezed her hand, and his smile widened as he lifted it, bringing it against his mouth. He kissed her palm, sending a rush of need along her skin. Corinne swallowed as she attempted to slip her hand free, but she was powerless to remove it, and it remained encased in Jack's. "How did I—" Jack smiled and leaned in close, bringing his mouth against her ear. "Get here?" he whispered. "I might have helped you out a bit, but you simply did as your desires dictated." Corinne gasped as Jack shortened the distance between them, trying without success to keep a respectable amount of personal space. She became aware of his body as it pressed against hers, and of his heat, which was hotter than the fire itself. She had always known that Jack was a witch. Anyone could have gotten that from the pentagram he wore around his neck, but she'd never realized that he was capable of doing whatever this was until now. Jack slid his hands into her hair. Cupping the back of her head, he drew her toward him and pressed his mouth against hers. His lips were warm and soft, and Corinne melted against him, as though they'd kissed each other 1,000 times. Only everything felt new to her, as though with every movement of their mouths she was experiencing things for the first time, a young woman being seduced by the essence of her dreams. Jack caressed her bottom lip with his tongue, and she opened for him, allowing the taste of him to stimulate her, to overpower her senses. Jack's tongue came more deeply into her mouth. Corinne breathed in and out as his strong hands explored her body. Her skin tingled, and she ached to feel Jack's hands touching her beneath her clothes. She wanted more, needed to feel his skin against hers. Her taut nipples strained against the fabric of her bra as Jack's hands slid along her torso, stopping just below her aching breasts. "Don't stop," she begged on a breath. Attempting to place his hands where she wanted them, she said, "Please, touch me, Jack. I need you to touch me." Jack looked into her eyes. He smiled, taking her unsteady hand and bringing it against his lips. He touched her shoulder. Everything went black.